There's a lot of conversations at the moment around concerns for the average amount of testosterone that men have got, estrogens in the water and stuff like that. Should we be worried? How worried should we be?
Yeah. So I just recently came back from Copenhagen. I was there to give a talk for the Lundbeck Foundation, and there was another talk that the Lundbeck Foundation put on. They do a great popular science series called Coffee and Cocktails. I'm not a drinker, but it's so European. It's so different than over here in the States.
Was everybody smoking outside?
No one was smoking, but people were allowed to bring in real glasses with ice in them, and yet the auditorium was silent. This was a big it's in the concert hall in Copenhagen. It's a very beautiful venue, and you couldn't hear an ice cube chink the entire night. No clink, 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 no chinking of the ice cubes. People were in there with their cocktails and enjoying science. And earlier that week, there was a talk by Dr. Shana Swan. She wrote a book called Countdown. She went on Joe Rogan's podcast, I believe earlier last year. She talked about the decline of sperm counts from the 1930s until now, and ties it in she's a serious researcher with National Institutes of Health grants, et cetera, ties this to the increasing presence of phthalates, the most difficult word to pronounce in the English language besides ophthalmology. Phthalates that are present mainly in pesticides. If you look at sperm counts and testosterone levels in males in different areas of the United States, they are significantly lower in areas where there's a lot of pesticide use, in rural areas where there's a lot of farming and pesticides. Very serious issue. And in the offspring of mothers that ingest phthalates, there's the anogenital distance is what they study in the lab.
The what?
The anogenital distance, literally the distance between the base of the scrotum and the anus in males is much greater than it is in
I can't believe
females.
There's a word for that.
Females don't have a scrotum, obviously, so they measure from the base of the genitals to the base of the vagina to the anus. In males, they go from the base of the scrotum. It depends on the study. Sometimes it's the top of the scrotum. I always say, you always have to be careful when people are measuring anything related to genitalia because somebody's going to cheat in the measurement. So in any event, I don't know how they controlled for that, but she shows these remarkable pictures in mice and in humans of people that are exposed, or mice that are exposed to phthalates, and basically males are showing the more female-like pattern of anogenital distance when they're exposed to these phthalates in utero. Okay, this is not post-birth. This is in utero. The mother's being exposed. It crosses the blood-placental barrier. What's happening? Well, this is reducing sperm counts. Now, what can people do about this? Well, first of all, there's this question of whether or not phthalates are having a similar effect after a child is brought into the world. One doesn't know, but we do know, and goes back to my early graduate work was on the effects of androgens like testosterone and DHT on different traits of brain and body. We know that, for instance, just very briefly, that during pregnancy, the brain is organized male by way of, believe it or not, testosterone converted to estrogen through a process called aromatization. But the growth of the penis, the fact that there even will be a penis, et cetera, is set by a testosterone called DHT, dihydrotestosterone. Testosterone converted to DHT through 5-alpha reductase and on. That's an organizing effect on the system, as they call it. But then there's an activating effect where during puberty, the testes just start producing testosterone. Some is converted to DHT, and the DHT is what creates the growth of the penis. Okay? In people that ingest phthalates during puberty and in the post-puberty years, it's conceivable that those phthalates could inhibit the activating effects of androgens, not just what we call the organizing effects of androgens early in life. Okay, why is this interesting and important? Well, sperm counts are definitely going down. Are they going down so much so that people are incapable of reproducing? Probably not, because, as they told us in school, it just takes one, and indeed it just takes one sperm, but it is a probability. It's a numbers game, right? The reason, people that take anabolic steroids, unless they do things to offset the effect on their own testosterone and sperm production, sperm counts are down, so the probability of successful insemination of the egg is reduced also. It's a numbers game. So it just takes one, but having many improves the probability that the one will be able to fertilize. So the short answer is yes, I think it is very concerning. Now, which things should we be concerned about? My understanding of the literature, and here I'm now venturing into territory for which I'm certainly not an expert, is that things like plastics that have BPAs may be a concern. Drinking water may be a concern. But the most serious or enriched source of BPAs are things like printed receipts.
I was out for dinner the other night. This was probably about a month and a half ago. And the server came over and I reached for the receipt. And as I was going for it like this, one of the girls who I'd never met before, she's a creator online, hit my hand away. I was like, are you really going to touch that? And this is the first time I've ever heard about this. Yeah. This is legit.
Yeah, printed receipts are a rich source of BPAs.
And topically, that could come through the skin?
Yeah, it could go transdermally. I mean, now, you'd probably have to handle a lot of receipts. I mean, I don't think you're...
But if you're a checkout cashier, perhaps, this would be the sort of thing...
Definitely checkout cashiers. And listen, it's going to vary. Some people are operating with a testosterone level and sperm count that's already back on its heels, so to speak. Some people have abundant testosterone and sperm. So it's really going to depend on the individual. I don't think people should get paranoid or delusional about any of this.
But just don't start sleeping in a bed of receipts.
Don't start sleeping in a bed of receipts. That's an interesting, there are all sorts of jokes that could be made about that one that I won't make. But there are also some other things like, do a little bit of online research about phthalates and don't go to fringe sites. Go to Dr. Shana Swan's website, right? I believe she's at Mount Sinai or one of the other larger medical schools in New York. Go to her website. She's a legitimate researcher and see what's there. See what the sources of phthalates are. Pesticides. Does that mean you should only eat organic fruits and vegetables? Maybe. I don't know which pesticides people are using on which fruits and vegetables, right? So there's some research that needs to be done. But the moment we start talking this way and people start saying, oh, wow, this is really like hippie science. This isn't hippie science. This is serious NIH-funded researcher saying phthalates before birth can dramatically alter the trajectory of the male's ability to make sperm and testosterone. Phthalates in puberty may be able to do that, but we know that androgens, in particular DHT and testosterone converted to estrogen, have a powerful role in masculinizing the brain and body during those years. Why wouldn't people be, do half an hour of research online? Or for instance, the abundant data that melatonin suppresses puberty, and yet people will take melatonin like it was,
insane super physiological levels.
Yeah. Am I saying melatonin is going to suppress your puberty? If you took it as a kid, you're messed up? No. And yet it's very easy to replace it with some of the healthier alternatives that are out there. So I think that one can have a thoughtfulness about this stuff and it's action oriented without having to really freak out about it.
How do you think that creators like Derek from More Plates, More Dates or Greg Doucette or someone has changed the way that the internet understands hormonal profiles and supplementation? Because since watching a lot of Derek's stuff, since he's become big on YouTube, I have been much more considering the balance that's inside of my body. But I don't think that was super common before guys like him were around.
Yeah, look, Derek's not a scientist by training, but he's done an immense service to the world because no one was talking about this stuff. It was talked about in bodybuilding circles where they talk very openly. It was starting to emerge in testosterone replacement therapy clinics. And then mostly guys were doing this stuff and lying about it, right? They're doing it, but then they don't want to talk about it. Actually, kudos to Joe Rogan, who years ago came out and said, yeah, he decided to start doing TRT and low dose of testosterone. He's already successfully reproduced. And so he brought it up and it's clear that this is becoming more common. Here are some of the general principles that I think, forgive me, Derek, if I get this wrong in terms of what you believe, because I never want to speak for anybody else, but my read of the science and the actual protocols speak to the idea that many people do not need testosterone replacement. Young guys should really avoid doing anabolic steroids. It can really mess up their system, not just physically, not just for the ability to have kids later, but lead to all sorts of sexual issues and sexual performance issues. Like there needs to be some medical incentive, right? Hypogonadism, for instance. But at the point where someone either has banked sperm or decides they don't want any more kids or is willing to do something like take HCG to maintain testicular and function and spermatogenesis, it's very clear that going with the lowest, doctor described, right? I'm not talking about illicit use. The lowest possible dosage of testosterone therapy is going to be better than, for instance, taking 200 milligrams in a 1 ml injection every 2 weeks, right? Because you get these huge increases and then these troughs. So people
Is this something that you've learned from Derek?
Yes, and in talking with other people, and I'm no longer doing this, but I did a run of it from 45 to 46 years old, and nothing before that. And I did it because I'm working on a book really that has a whole section on hormone therapies. I wanted to see what it was like. I'll tell you, basically testosterone gives you more energy to work more, if it's done appropriately, right?
Maybe that's the secret for Lex. Maybe Homeboy's just brimming.
He's brimming. And I'll say when I went into it, my levels were mid-range. They were fine, high to mid-range. They were kind of like 7s, 8s, but I was doing some supplementation to support that. I've since gone back to that. It was funny, when you say something on the internet, people think that means it's forever, right? It is possible to start and come off, right? So what I've done. And so here's what's relevant here. People are now spacing out, 30 milligrams on Monday, 30 milligrams on Wednesday, 30 milligrams on Friday is like kind of a low reasonable dose. Again, talk to your doctor. These aren't recommended dosages. That's more typical. Another thing that's really important is that people have traditionally blocked estrogen by increases while doing this by taking an aromatase inhibitor, Nolvadex, Arimidex, these kinds of things. That almost often is a bad idea, almost often, because having enough estrogen around allows you to maintain cognitive function and libido. A lot of guys think it's just, and it is true, if estrogen is very high and testosterone is very low, libido can suffer. But if testosterone is very high and estrogen is very low, libido can really suffer. So a lot of people who are crushing their estrogen realize that by coming off some of those drugs, they feel far better. Far better. So most people I know that are doing this are taking low doses of testosterone semi-frequently throughout the week, 20 to 30 milligrams every other day or so. There's a lot of variation around this. And then not doing anything to reduce aromatase, or if they are taking very low doses, not 1 milligram of Arimidex, but maybe something like 0.1 milligrams of Arimidex every third day or so. Again, not a recommendation. Talk to your doctor. The smarter clinics are starting to think about this. And actually, I don't have any financial relationship to Derek or to Merrick Health, which is his clinic, but from what I understand, they do a very good job. I did help them design a mostly herbal supplement for testosterone support for people who are not on TRT, as things like Tonga, Ali, Fadoja. But unbeknownst to most people, I've not made 1 penny on that. That was just based on a conversation of the research with him and Dr. Kyle Gillette and a few other people. So estrogen can help maintain libido. Also, it can increase libido. Now, here's something I learned that's really interesting from Peter Attia recently. Women, as we know, make both testosterone and estrogen, and of course a bunch of other hormones too. If they get their blood work back and you were to adjust the units that those hormones are measured in, nanograms per deciliter in some cases, picograms per deciliter in other cases, if you normalize them all to the same nanograms per deciliter, you would find that a healthy woman has more testosterone than she does estrogen. That's right. I asked him this 3 times. I'm like, you're telling me that women have more testosterone circulating in them than estrogen? He said, absolutely. Now maybe there's a caveat to that during some phase of the menstrual cycle, but that does not mean that their testosterone levels are higher than that of men. But this is remarkable, right? This means that these androgens, testosterone and are doing interesting things in men and in women, and estrogen, as we just described, are doing really interesting things, certainly in women and in men. So this idea of more testosterone, less estrogen good is always the case. That's simply false. You have to think about whether or not it's a man, whether or not it's a woman, whether or not the goal is more or less. Typically people aren't going for less libido, but I suppose it's possible.
Some people out there with that.
Some people might be highly distracted by an excessive libido, right? That's a different story. And then of course DHT. So I think one of the things that Derek has really contributed to the world, and I think is important for people to know, that a lot of the drugs that are used to treat hair loss, finasteride, Propecia, things like that, block DHT receptors, dihydrotestosterone. DHT is responsible for beard growth in the face and for balding, male pattern baldness. People, because they want their hair, will take these drugs. If they take them in pill form, they're blocking DHT everywhere, and they can experience severe defects in libido and sexual performance. Now, before that,
a choice between your hair and your erection.
For a lot of people, it is, right? I mean, there are now topical things, and Derek talks about all this kind of thing. They're topical.
He went really deep.
He goes really deep into all this. And what's interesting is, we also can take a step back and say, like, what's the landscape of health information that created this opportunity for a kid in his 20s? By the way, no one knows his last name. Very clever. No one knows his last name.
Well played, Derek.
It's kind of an avatar of a human, right? Although he's real. What created this landscape for this guy to be able to get this information out there, even though he's not a physician, he's not a scientist? And I think what it is that he saw that there was all this information nested in these very niche communities that most people don't want to look like a bodybuilder, right? Yeah. And yet what he did was he sort of normalized the discussion about hormones. He normalized the discussion about other things like dopamine and cortisol, et cetera. And what's interesting is that science now is kind of following suit. 10 years ago, a discussion about hormone therapies would never come up in the hallways of discussions with my colleagues. Since doing an episode of the podcast on optimizing testosterone and estrogen, no fewer than 10 of, I'm not going to name names, but these are serious scientists, and it's a mixture of men and women, have approached me about hey, what can one do in order to adjust testosterone or estrogen levels? Is estrogen therapy for menopause a useful thing? When should one start? Now, I'm not an endocrinologist, so all I can do is point them in the way of information, but this is an important area, and here's why. Hormones control neuromodulators like dopamine, estrogen, and so on. And those neuromodulators powerfully influence our states of mind. So if your hormones are out of whack, your neuromodulators are going to be out of whack. Typically, the treatment for depression would be to go in and just give a serotonin reuptake inhibitor or Wellbutrin type dopamine thing. Now that has its use. But I love this trend now, not towards hormone therapy necessarily, but just toward a thinking, a mindset of how deep in the layers of my biology can I go to create these sort of waves of health that rise up to the level of ability to focus, and et cetera. For so many years, it's all been attacked at the surface, kind of the waves on the surface of the ocean. And yet there's this we're now talking about the deep tectonic plates movements that are affecting all that in any case.